In truth, Black Baltimoreans don't even have to factor in slavery to prove a solid case for reparations, as certain residents are able to sprint through our city's tree-lined lanes of structural racism and navigate intersections of gentrification and redlining. The vast majority of Baltimore natives are dashing daily through a matrix of food deserts, vacant houses, and nonprofit institutions that continue to thrive by keeping Black people dependent on their bus passes and grocery boxes. Pay up and get out the way.
Wade in the water.
You know, reparation is a lot. It starts from the admitting of reparations, of what's needed.
Black people need power. We need the power to define our own destiny.
When they enslaved us, when they came down and put their foot on their neck, they took away our resources and our access. Thus, the trauma, the violence, you see, the lack of education, all of that is a result of not having access and resources because our generational wealth has been stolen from us. And this is where reparations come in at. It has to be returned.
Typically, generational wealth refers to the ability to pass valuable assets down from one generation to the next. These assets often include cash, real estate, art investments, or even stakes in family businesses. But for most of Black Baltimore's native population, this is a privilege they may never afford.
In America in particular, we know that we suffered a particular form of damage that needs to be repaired.
You have to understand racism to understand America.
It's one big cheating game. The white folks, Europeans, they are like 50 yards, 100 yards ahead of us, and we starting 200-400 years later.
And institutional racism, that's a thing. That is what America is.
My great-grandfather, who was a slave here in Maryland, actually produced wealth here, not for his family, but for others. At the end of the Civil War, they granted us, or were to grant us, 40 acres and a mule, only to turn around and take it from us, because they realized that land is the basis of all value.
In 1865, Major General W.T. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, granting 40 acres of tillable ground to the enslaved Black people who were freed under President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. By June of 1865, approximately 40,000 freed Africans had actually been allocated over 400,000 acres of land. But after the assassination of Lincoln in the same year, America's new president, Andrew Johnson, quickly began the process of rescinding thousands of newly granted land titles and returned them to the original Confederate plantation owners.
God is gonna trouble these waters.
That harmed my lineage, and that continued in my father's time, in my time.
Remember, this was a slave port, and in reality, too much hasn't changed since.
Until I came to Baltimore, I just lived under this haze, of racism is something that happened at specific periods of points in time in our society. There was slavery, there was Jim Crow. However, when you really understand the factual history, you see it is a continuum of harm. It started 400 years ago and it's never stopped. And it impacts every part of our system.
In America, the Black family makes about 1 cent on the dollar compared to a white family.
Because the cost of living is going up at the same time that these individuals are trying to make a way for themselves and their families, but their dollars are not going up.
Knowing that always in the back of your mind, like, why do I have to be twice as great when you just have to be average? But it's our reality, it's not fair.
The bigger problem here in Baltimore is a disinvestment in certain areas, which is the continuation of redlining,
In 1911, Baltimore's mayor, J. Barry Mahul, signed the first American ordinance that legally prohibited Black people from moving into communities occupied by white people. Though Ordinance number 610 was the first of its kind, it affirmed his campaign slogan and a national idea that had already been blatantly present on a local level, that Baltimore is a white man's city.
Banks literally put a red line around and said, do not make loans to anybody in those areas. And the denial of being able to buy houses by a lot of Black folk in this country turned into intergenerational poverty.
When my grandmother wanted to buy a house, my grandmother is very fair skinned. So oftentimes people thought that she was white. She actually had to go to the bank, and when she went to the bank, she could actually pass for white. So that's how she was able to get her first loan.
In 1917, Baltimore unleashed a new real estate tactic, blockbusting, which encouraged white flight and created Black blight.
Started looking at listings online, and my mortgage company that I was going through assigned me a real estate agent. And she said to me, people like you usually live in Canton or Fed Hill. She just kept not showing us this particular house that we were so interested in. We were being racially steered out of living in an integrated neighborhood. She was trying to perpetuate segregation by keeping us in a predominantly white neighborhood.
Literally, you're taking real estate and financial institutions and deliberately disenfranchising people for your benefit. Simple as that.
That if you have something that's going to increase your tax base, it's going to create public safety, all right, it's going to empower your community, which empower your country, and you choose not to, that means that it's malice. That means that it's intentionally being done to stop the Black community from being where it really should be.
I remember the police couldn't get a good view from the helicopters, and so they had the trees cut down. It's attributed to environmental issues because now there's not something to take all the pollution and the smog out of the air that used to be there, even in that little small block.
There's just been active destruction of not just preventing Black people from accumulating wealth, but actually destruction of wealth. All these different communities, Black communities, were being destroyed. The ones that were becoming affluent were being destroyed by white people.
Under the proposed routing of the interstate highways through Baltimore, I-70 would have been routed through West Baltimore to join I-95. The wide median space was originally reserved for an additional branch of the Baltimore Metro subway link system, ironically called the Red Line. But since the abrupt construction cancellation of I-70 in 2015, the spur, now known as the Highway to Nowhere, has been left stranded from the rest of Baltimore's interstate highway and continues to divide West Baltimore.
If you know anything about the Highway to Nowhere, my family used to live along the road where the Highway to Nowhere goes through. My grandmother's house, my father's house, several cousins and aunts were displaced by this highway that kind of basically just went through their neighborhood and broke them up.
In Maryland, eminent domain gives the government power to take your property, even if you don't want to sell, as long as it's for public use.
When I was a little girl, we used to all live in South Baltimore, and they busted South Baltimore up in order to build the harbor. So then that meant they separated the family.
The impact of redlining and displacement of neighborhoods has resulted in the dilapidation that we see today.
People that want you to become less than what you are will introduce you to the insignificance of your environment.
We end up living in what's called ghettos. Ghettos, which are social constructs of city agencies, which are planned, designed neighborhoods that are meant to keep you oppressed and out of access to resources.
Housing projects were intentional efforts made by the United States federal government to centralize poverty and to keep our people impoverished and to keep us in certain social and living conditions.
I lived in a food desert, which is also caused by redlining because resources were not allocated to my community for grocery stores to be there.
And it starts with food deserts, right? Because first off, you can't be of sound health, mind, and body. Your breakfast is chips. The juice you drink is all syrup.
It leads to several things: diet-related issues, premature death, diabetes, hypertension. We're not able to live full lives.
One prime example of how structural racism and redlining drastically impacts the Black communities can be found in a specific 2-mile radius between Waverly and Baltimore's Green Mountain North community. This densely populated food desert is home to 3 dialysis centers, but not one grocery store that sells fresh produce.
You actually start off at a dis-ease, and then you go and you be in a collected group of other individuals like you.
I grew up in Walbrook Junction. Within that time, there was no shopping center. There was no big market.
Baltimore's most isolated Black neighborhood, Cherry Hill, is one of America's largest public housing projects, with over 1,000 units, private homes, and several other low-income apartments throughout the community. With such a blatant lack of resources, Cherry Hill has become one of America's strategically impoverished communities.
When I went on a ride-along with the police department, one of the areas I went into was Cherry Hill. The officer actually pointed out to me a box truck. That's basically the grocery store here. It was a truck that sold snacks out of the back. And that was the only food that those residents had access to within walking distance.
And when you begin to accept that this is normal for us, hatred sets in, alienation sets in.
They wonder sometimes why our communities are so violent.
They're very quick to say, well, that person's just out of control, or they're too much, or they're angry, or they're this, and not hearing what the problem is, that this is coming from a place of desperation to make a better situation for their children and their families.
They have dumbed our children down by not giving us the kind of resources and the proper systems of education.
Personally, I still suffer from being educated in Baltimore City public school system. My experience comes from a poor education, a person who always fought to express himself because I couldn't speak until the age of 11.
My criminal record started when I was about 9 years old. We became expert juvenile delinquents, but we didn't know what juvenile delinquent was. We were never educated into that. We didn't know the history of how we were put in this position to be juvenile delinquents.
African American youth represent over 70% of the youth jail population in Baltimore City. Per capita, only Alabama sends more of its kids into adult court than Maryland.
You was a baby caught up in the system.
And yet, the police officers, time and time again, were dehumanizing this population.
Police in our community, they weren't there to protect Black people. They were there to patrol and monitor the Black community.
The origins of modern-day policing can be easily traced back to the early 1700s with the creation of the Slave Patrol. It had one mission: to establish a system of terror and squash slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners. But by the 1900s, cities began to establish police departments to enforce Jim Crow laws. Local municipalities then leaned on police to enforce and exert excessive brutality on African Americans who violated any Jim Crow law. More than 400 Baltimore police officers have been the subject of at least one complaint of physical violence against a member of the public. Over 90% of officers' use of force between 2015 and 2019 was targeted towards Baltimore's Black residents, who account for more than 60% of of the city's population.
They place drugs on us. They beat us. They violate our human rights. Have you ever seen a grown man get his pants pulled down in the middle of the street and they do an anal search? That's what they do to us.
On a couple of occasions, my grandmother's front door has been knocked down and house ransacked. And then it was like a oops, wrong address. And nobody paid for the damages. Nobody said, I apologize, what can I do to fix this? Nobody even fixed the door.
Ununiformed cops had just beat up a 14-year-old kid, just stopped beside him and didn't say anything to him, just jumped out of the cars and started wailing on him. You don't have plainclothes cops, two grown men jump out of a car and beat up a 14-year-old kid.
My mom was arrested in Arbutus. She caught a guy, he said he was spray painting the curb. He clearly was gearing up to spray paint the car, and she caught him. She didn't touch him. All she did was smack the spray paint can out his hand. The can was missing, the cops came, they took my mom from the house in handcuffs.
There's no way I could envision that same treatment happening to white people. I don't see a police officer ever barking at me, literally, to get me to take action to do something.
The same police district served both communities, this relatively affluent white community and this relatively poor African American community. Same cops were operating. And so the same people that would come to my condo and say, Mr. Wernsdorfer, what can we do for you? How can we help you? Were the same ones that were using truncheons to beat the black kids in Park Heights.
When black boys are let the gun point and the cops release that lead, they start acting funny, like they can't breathe because I let in their skulls at them reacting funny. It's funny.
There's always this fear that they're going to get in trouble for something minor that my own child could probably very well get away with very easily. Black teenage boys in West Baltimore in particular had to stay behind bars because they couldn't come up with the money for bail, or are facing long imprisonment because they can't afford the lawyer that's going to make the deal.
The number of black men that are in jail and the way we see our communities spiraling downward, those things are related.
No city in Maryland is impacted by mass incarceration as much as Baltimore. Baltimore City has the highest incarceration rate in the state, with 1 in every 100 residents locked up in a state prison. Overall, the state of Maryland has a black population of almost 30%. Yet African Americans make up 71% of its prison population.
So prior to Bill Clinton's crime bill, that was written by Joe Biden, right? And people don't know that the president wrote the language for the 1994 crime bill that separated black families and made it whereas if you had a felony, you couldn't go home to your family if they were receiving subsidized housing.
The harm that prison causes and these laws that have been based on the institution of slavery, on disparity, it harms us and it traumatizes us.
And I think that a lot of times when we actually look at those that have probably impacted our family through getting locked up or something, we have to look at the other hand. Was that the cards that they were dealt, that they knew that they wanted more and deserved more, but society didn't provide that for them. They just thought that and knew that they deserved better.
I was doing 30-year sentence, 2 30-year sentences. I had already been questioning my situation, but I had no way of understanding the historical context of how I arrived at the situation that I was in.
I served 21 years in prison on a life sentence, so it was during that time where I was able to really dig in, figure out who I wanted to be first. And when I got out, they don't do wraparound services, right? So housing was an issue. Employment was an issue. I couldn't pass a background check. I couldn't get a job with Amazon, Lyft, or anywhere else. But there are a lot of organizations, air quote, doing the work for people like myself. So they speak for us, oftentimes with our stories, getting grant money, oftentimes not having that trickle down to us for having the lived experience.
They come in these positions not recognizing that you don't know where these people come from and how you're going to serve them properly.
The resources, the people with the money are not helping. It's the people who are already downtrodden that are trying to do the work. And it's not always working because we don't have the access.
So I'm insulted by some of these government programs and some of these different funding that they give out to Black people and 1 million people apply for it. All those programs are useless.
About 100 of these organizations, some white, but mostly Black, joined up with Strong City Baltimore, an organization that was founded and led by white people originally. Strong City Baltimore recently just closed up all their fiscal sponsor work, shut off all these fiscally sponsored organizations, and primarily for those Black organizations, kept their money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So many grassroots organizations that don't exist anymore, or having to revitalize or restore their work because of this white institution that was supposed to handle money. You had one job, and they failed miserably. And they still get funding, and we're all trying to recuperate from what they did.
You have institutions like Strong City that are supposed to be acting in our best interest, in many cases just exploiting our labor for their own benefit.
64 Civil Rights Bill was not to repair us. 65 Voting Rights Bill was not to repair us. 68 Fair Housing Bill was not to repair us. That had no intention. They cannot repair me, all right? They may be unable to repair my children. My grandchildren suffer. But hopefully, greater reparation can come in the future to right all those wrongs.
There's a human right to live fully and define what that looks like in our own context.
I want people to have clean water. I want people to have clean air. I want people to have access to food. I want people to have access to the services that they need.
Any conversation about reparations for Black people without considering land is one that is short-sighted. The ability to build wealth, to transfer wealth passed through generations.
For me, reparations is wiping that slate clean, right? And making it illegal for someone not to be able to get a job. Literally for these businesses to be fined if they don't hire individuals based on criminal record.
We're still asking today to have a level playing field, to be just as successful as the next person. Like, we deserve it. Why do we even have to ask? Why do we have to get to the point that we even have to ask?
Here you go, Mama.
When the door's being closed on them, the minute they try to open it, it's demoralizing, it's exhausting, it's a constant battle just to get what your family needs.
We gotta decide who we wanna be and who we wanna be with.
It's people in the community who know what needs to happen in this community to make it better.
It's going to take us to educate us about it. An outside person who has caused the harm can't come in and talk about our harm.
The model of white people helping African Americans is completely racist and defunct. And it's not working, doesn't work, shouldn't work.
Black people need to have power to exert control over our quality of life without the intervention of others, and sovereignty.
Until we could change the narrative where we're Black people are making Black people decisions, okay, reparation don't start. Because trickle down does not work for us, all right? It does not.
History has illustrated that Black people certainly possess the agency to build thriving communities, such as the time during Reconstruction and the creation of Black Wall Streets in Durham, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Richmond, Virginia, to name a few. However, anytime individual Black communities have become too financially successful, it has resulted in the government-sanctioned destruction of those same communities.
As a people, we need to heal and we need to be educated. And those of us who know what's happening need to educate the ones who don't. You cannot change what you don't confront. So if you don't know it exists, you're just navigating in it, not knowing that you are now a victim of it. You can't change it.
Advocates for reparations argue that there are several compelling reasons why the American government should grant economic reparations to Black people, while reparation opponents believe that crimes of the past should stay in the past.
It's funny how we'll give our children inoculations for measles, mumps, and rubella when they're, but we don't give our children like a cultural inoculation. Like, what do we have to do inside of ourselves to repair the damage that has been done to us?
So what are we really doing? We're trying to spread the word, tell a story. What's the call to action?
Let's be clear. Until Black Americans have the agency over stating our own harm and the sovereignty to redevelop our communities on our own terms, any idea of reparative and restorative justice is just that, an idea.
Any policy that will benefit Black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, what I want is community organizers. I want those community organizers to be free of government attachment as to what they can or what they can't teach.
Affiliate with a group that is dealing with reparations. We got to start running candidates that will support the struggle for reparations.
We have to move now to be able to address the issues of housing insecurity and food insecurity, the racial wealth gap, the educational disparities.
We got to start asking these white politicians and Black politicians, do you support reparations?
The United States has made reparations in part for Native Americans. The United States have made reparations for Japanese that were in internment camps. The United States has not made any reparations for the Black community.
With the legalization of recreational cannabis, Baltimore City will be the first jurisdiction to implement a reparations commission that will be financially supported by taxes generated from statewide cannabis sales.
At the federal level, it's all but stalled, and Baltimore is the first one to pass a reparations bill. What it'll focus on is once the resources start flowing to the Community Reinvestment Fund, then that commission will be able to determine how those resources are spent. It's actually not even a demand, it's an invitation for Black people here who are concerned about reparations and want to be on that commission to join it.
I want to see the government acknowledge that there's a problem in redlined communities in Baltimore City.
Stop the loan system and just give us the resources.
I want $365,000 given to each Sandtown Legacy resident.
There are enough vacant homes in the city of Baltimore where the city could invest in fixing those houses up and giving those houses to the people in those communities.
Have reparations where these houses can be turned into homes.
Begin to experiment with how to develop our own communities separated from white people. And at the same time, white people need to give us all the resources that we need.
Pay up, get out the way.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, I said wade in the water. God is gonna trouble these waters. They must have heard that one. They heard that water was our ticket to freedom, so they put that lead in it. Made sure we can't drink the water they trying to drown us in. Stop Black man at the border to put that lead in him. Made sure Black man don't walk on water, so they told us a white man did. That's how we found Black man dead. Made sure to remove us from his holy water, but we all got a little God in us. So now they kill us with his Jesus peace and leave our bodies to wade in the... When lead is brought to a boiling point, it releases more poison, which causes an adverse reaction when ingested, like when Black boys led to gunpoint and the cops release that lead, they start acting funny, like they can't breathe because that learning their scores at them reacting funny. It's funny, cause racism be that pill we can't swallow. So they made sure we have no water to wash them down with. Like the states for the most black people ain't got no water to wash them down with. Like they don't have the essentials to rid their body of sin. So they can't have a pure life, can't nestle in the body of water we call God. So now they teach black kids about the water they can't have. But how you teach about the ocean and not the slaves in it? Why you think that water got so much wave in it? It's cause of all the black people that wade in it. We're not afraid of water. We just know what happened if we stay in it. But aren't y'all the ones afraid to bathe in it? Too white to wash away your privilege? So it's time for our tides to turn. It's time for them to feel the weight in the water. It's time for God's ark to crash into white bodies like two slave ships, cause no one knows what we left behind. Time for them to see what this aqua finna do. They won't drink no more wine after God loads the clip and empties out his hydro flask. No Eve will be missed. Skip straight to Christmas, christen white bodies, and we can't leave their children. And we won't forget Adam or his family. Take out his hydrogen. Now oxygen's the only atoms we have left. Who's left? Yeah, Abel won't be. Legs won't move once Cain comes back for round 2. But we keep it 100 so the Benjamins can stay. Cause you can take your sin, but you can't take your money to the grave. Once God is done drowning them in his holy water, it'll be our turn to have baptisms that aren't poison. Our turn to swim out of our own free will, not survival. Our turn to have water that is not stirred with the tips of pencils. So white people, don't forget that God is gonna trouble these waters.